most pickleball clubs are making the majority of their revenue on food and beverage. Why? Because there's an unlimited amount of courts in parks, or you could potentially just build a court in your backyard by drawing the lines. Because of that, people are not willing to pay premium prices to go and play pickleball because it's very accessible. Paddle is the opposite. There's a scarcity value. There's almost no courts. There's only 400 courts in the US today. And if you compare it to countries like Spain that has 20,000 courts or Sweden that has 5,000 courts, the US, it really has a scarcity value.
Welcome back to the Fitt Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Veneri. Today I'm joined by Santiago Gomez, founder and CEO of Padel Haus. In this episode, we talk about the company's membership club, combining court access with luxury amenities and social experiences. Santiago shares his expansion plans with new openings slated for New York, Nashville, Denver, and Atlanta. Plus, we discuss Padel's explosive growth, the economics of membership clubs, and the future of racket sports in the US. Let's get into it. The Fitt Insider Podcast is presented by EGYM. EGYM's smart fitness ecosystem is transforming healthcare through exercise. Combining strength equipment with AI-powered software and corporate wellness platform WellPass, it's leading the shift to proactive, preventative health. Learn more about EGYM's intelligent workout solutions at egym.com. Hi, Santiago. Welcome to Fitt Insider. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Joe. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat. I think, listeners have heard a lot about kind of the racket sports boom, especially in the US. This is, no surprise or nothing new internationally, but maybe for folks who aren't familiar, and just to kick things off, can you tell us about Padel Haus and introduce yourself?
Of course, Padel Haus is a paddle operator. Paddle is a racket sport, as you mentioned, was invented in Mexico in 1969. A person that did not have enough space to build a tennis court and lived kind of in a cliff, built a smaller version of a tennis court with walls on the side, so the walls wouldn't go to the ocean. And in paddle, we use the walls to hit the ball across the net to the other side. Paddle is only played doubles. You play 2 against 2. The court is 33 by 66. And yes, you can use the walls to hit off the walls. You can hit to the walls and over to the other side of a net. Squash, for example, does not have a net, and you're playing just directly to a wall. But paddle is somewhat similar to tennis, racquetball, and squash.
How did you become familiar with it? How did you even start to participate in it? And then what made you think, hey, I can bring this kind of club experience to the US and really scale it?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I was born and raised in Mexico where the sport was invented. So during my teenage years, instead of playing tennis or instead of playing football, soccer, I was playing paddle. I moved to the US about 15 years ago after going to college in Mexico. And that's when I stopped playing paddle because there was nowhere to play. And then more recently, during the pandemic, I was in Mexico during the pandemic, and I rediscovered paddle. And at that point, I heard some clubs in Miami were opening and they were quite successful. So I decided to take the same idea, open it in New York for the first time. And yeah, and that's how Padel Haus came about.
And for somebody, who's either new to this idea of like a racket club or, a membership-based club where people are going and playing, what does that experience look like when you think, hey, this is what I want to create. This is the environment, the amenities, what they gain access to, and really that whole experience.
Yes, I always say that we're not just a sports club. We are a hospitality brand. So it's a full experience when you come to the club. Not only do you find courts, you find premium locker rooms, premium showers, you find multiple social lounges, you find steam rooms, ping pong tables. We're just opening our club here in Nashville that has also a golf simulator, has a kids room, and then that way we're adding more amenities to every new location.
When you think of that, like, when building a hospitality brand. I think there's, listeners might be familiar with, if they're not familiar with like racket clubs, they're, probably familiar with like different health clubs, wellness clubs, boutiques, fitness studios. When you look at this kind of landscape and you're thinking about creating this concept and now scaling it and adding new amenities to different clubs, are you in your mind thinking, oh, I want it to be comparable to this, or we can borrow different concepts for that? Or are you thinking, like, how do we differentiate it from all these things that currently exist that people might be familiar with?
I think our concepts are paddle only and will remain paddle alone. There are concepts that integrate multiple racket sports into one. Ours is focused solely on paddle, and all the other things that I mentioned are more services rather than actual part of the business.
When you talk about like the business, obviously you have like the membership component and different services. Are there other kind of revenue lines, business lines?
Well, yeah, there's many sources of revenue. One, of course, you mentioned is memberships, which is our recurring revenue. We have core bookings, which are the majority of our revenue. Then we have food and beverage sales. We have event sales, and then we have the academy, which is how you learn to play and how what gets people in the door and probably remain playing for the years to come.
The pickleball boom, that gaining a lot of traction, people having an awareness of that. Where do you put paddle on that like spectrum? Is it so new that like you have to do this work of informing people what it is? Is it have that momentum that now people are seeking you out because they know what it is? And like, how do you build that wave or ride that wave depending on like where it is on that spectrum?
It's a very good point that you mentioned pickleball now. Pickleball, most pickleball clubs are making the majority of their revenue on food and beverage. Why? Because there's an unlimited amount of courts in parks, or you could potentially just build a court in your backyard by drawing the lines. Because of that, people are not willing to pay premium prices to go and play pickleball because it's very accessible. Paddle is the opposite. There's a scarcity value. There's almost no courts. There's only 400 courts in the U.S. today, and if you compare it to countries like Spain that has 20,000 courts or Sweden that has 5,000 courts, the U.S. is it really has a scarcity value. So people come and what they pay is for the experience, but also the fact that there are not many courts around.
When you think of where you're going to go next in terms of building a location, is it based on like, hey, this where is where there seems to be an awareness of paddle, or where you think people a certain demographic could be receptive to it? Or do you think, hey, we have to go in there and kind of like activate this community, educate them, build awareness, and almost convert them to this sport versus there being some type of established like awareness of it?
Yes, when we look at where to open, we look at cities that are wellness first, that have racket sports developed. But of course, at the same time, in many of these markets, paddle is new. So we do go through the whole process of educating consumers. We did it in New York. We are doing it in Nashville now. And we're going to keep on doing it in Denver and Atlanta in the future openings. Right now, we have 3 locations in New York, 1 location in Nashville that's opening in the next 2 weeks. We're building in Denver that is opening at some point in the spring. Atlanta also opening in the spring, and we're opening a 4th location in New York, Greenpoint by summer 2025.
At this point, have you identified like, hey, these are the most important components of activating a new location or entering a new market, and this is what a quote unquote like successful launch looks like for you?
So New York, I think, was a little bit different because a lot of New Yorkers are transplants from or expats from Europe or from Latin America, which when we first opened, the majority of our members and players were people that played the sport before in their own countries. In Nashville, it's a little bit different. In Nashville, most people are local. There's not as many Europeans as there are in New York. But what I do see is that there's a lot of tennis players, and the conversion typically is one way. When a player grabs a paddle racket for the first time, they come from tennis. They typically change and start playing paddle and never return to tennis again. You only play doubles. More dynamic. There is more strategy in the game. In tennis, you only play the ball back and forth. And in paddle, you can play the ball behind your back, hit the wall, and you can keep the point still alive. And it's also less prone to injuries. Paddle is played in an AstroTurf that has rubber and turf, the same type of material they use in track and field stadiums. So it's less hard on the knees.
How much work do you do from like the brand perspective around, you mentioned it's more social, and I think a lot of people, whether they're looking for run clubs or group fitness studios or any other experience where they're getting together, they're looking for this type of connection and socializing. Do you kind of try to foster that, build that into the experience, connect members, host social events, or is it just the nature of the sport that it is more social and therefore it like just creates itself?
Well, the nature of the sport is social, but when you're talking about brands, I do know there's brands that are more focused on the competition part of the sport and just making it more about competing and improvement, whereas other brands are focused more on the experience and the community building that can be done either on site or off site. We spend a lot of time and resources on building communities in all these new markets that we're opening. We did it in New York, and we have a great community of more than 20,000 players that have passed through Padel Haus.
How do you continue to keep people like engaged? Is there a sense for, or maybe whether it's metrics or whether it's just continuing to enhance the experience for like, hey, this is how many times a week we want people coming back. This is what utilization looks like. This is how many times you need to use the membership over X period of time to say this is what like a sustained and kind of ideal location looks like.
I'm going to give you an interesting number. Every person that plays for a second time returns for a third time in 93% of the cases. So we have a 93% retention rate after visit number two. What does that tell you? Is that some people come, try it out, maybe they like it, maybe they don't, but once they did a little bit more, they're almost returning for a fact. And in terms of membership, you're talking about how often do people play Adele? I can tell you that for a membership to be worth it, to pay your monthly membership fee, it means that you're playing more than 7 hours a month.
Wow.
Most people play, every time they play 2 hours. But after 7 hours, that could be 3.5 visits. That could be, depends if you play 1 or 2 hours. But after 7 visits, that's when the membership pays off.
This episode of the Fitt Insider Podcast is brought to you by EGYM. EGYM makes some of the most innovative strength training machines on the market, but that's only one part of their integrated ecosystem. With connected fitness equipment, AI-powered gym software, and a comprehensive corporate wellness offering, it's forging the future of preventative health. Partnering with companies worldwide, EGYM's WellPass program improves employee health by expanding access to premier fitness and health facilities. Upgrading gym floors, EGYM equips every operator with smart equipment and AI tools to create hyper-personalized training plans for every exerciser. Putting it all together, they're transforming healthcare through exercise. Experience the power of EGYM's ecosystem at egym.com. Do you track how much time they're spending at the club and maybe they're not playing?
That's a super good question. There's players that come to the club that don't even play that day. We have co-working spaces, we have events, we have locker rooms, we have in New York, one of the clubs, we have a nice terrace where we do barbecues on the weekends. We have a golf simulator in Nashville. So people come to the club and they use that as their country club experience, but inside of the city.
There's a path where like this evolves and the sport and play is like a component of it, but there's like all these ancillary experiences, like country club aspect of it. Is it hard for you to not try to pack all this different stuff in there and pick and choose like what goes into the experience versus being like, hey, maybe people are asking for this and they're spending time, they have another membership to go do, this other thing elsewhere. Like, could we also offer it to them? Is there like a tech tension or a friction to like, hey, this is what we include and this is kind of where our experience stops?
We're kind of limited kind of on the size of the space, right? You cannot build
Yeah.
a golf course inside of one of our locations. No, but what we do is we prioritize the building the courts first, the number of courts that fit, and then with the remaining space, we design around the what the community is looking for. In Nashville, for example, we're building also a music room. Why? Because it's Music City. So we kind of like cater and go with the flow with what we will like in those city, and that's how we define what added services go on each location.
Growing at a fairly good clip, you're talking about opening I think 2 to 3 locations like just this spring. How have you approached funding this to this point? Having HQ owned locations versus is this a concept you want to franchise? What does that all look like as you continue to scale up?
Yeah, for now, all of our locations are 100% owned. We've raised 2 rounds so far, our seed round and our Series A, in which we raised a total of 14 million, little less than 14 million. And the plan is to just keep growing. Today, with the locations that I mentioned, we are the leading operator in the US. We want to retain our market share and keep growing. And I think there's potential to open in any tier 1 and tier 2 city of the US and still be successful, even if there are more than 3 or 4 clubs.
How do you characterize like your role at this point? Are you're on the ground at every location, scouting them, design, you're thinking, I mean, I'm sure you're doing all of these things, but if there was like a particular focus or something you gravitate towards or something you think, hey, my particular influence or contribution to this aspect of the business is a thing that, really differentiates it and moves the needle. How do you spend most of your time and how do you make this all happen?
I think my role has changed. When we first started the company, it was just be by myself. I'm founder and CEO, and I was wearing multiple hats. I was being a designer, a lawyer, a operator, a memberships director. I was working the front desk. I was doing almost everything. Today, in my role, I want to prioritize 3 things. One is growth. Another one is marketing, and then fundraising.
Do you feel like it's you're at the point where you can focus on the things you feel like you need to be focusing on? Or you feel like, maybe it's still a battle to do that. You're still kind of like building the team. Like, how is that process of like operationalizing those things and kind of like focusing your time to the things matter? How is that evolving?
Yeah, what I keep on saying to everyone at the company is we're no longer a startup. We're not a company that everybody needs to wear multiple hats. I think we all need to be very aware of what your role is and what your priorities should be. We have about 45 people working in the company now. We have a fully built management team. And as we were talking about fundraising, we're in Series B. So I think that part where you wear multiple hats and you try to do everything yourself, we passed that part. We've been in business for more than 2 years. We are profitable in all of our locations. So in order to keep on driving growth, you gotta make sure that you're focusing on the right things, not try to
Yeah.
do everything at once, especially at this stage.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think it's something that it gets overlooked when you're talking about, look, a brick and mortar company, you're on the ground, you're developing locations, from the design to the construction to the real estate to the marketing to the experience, the hospitality aspect. Has there been a surprise in terms of what's more challenging or what comes easier, or just maybe things that you didn't initially take into consideration when you're thinking about, scaling physical locations like this that, have presented themselves that you're either overcoming or trying to overcome as you think, hey, like this is how we get to the next stage?
Yeah, I mean, you already know this. Building brick and mortar is challenging just because it's brick and mortar and you depend on it's CapEx intensive. You also depend on permitting to open locations, which can be challenging. But at the same time, I think it also creates a barrier to entry for other people. So that way, at least for now, that's what has kept us being the only operator in the cities that we operate, at least in Padel. And my background is in restaurants. So before Padel Haus, I built 4 other restaurants in the US, throughout the US, different cities, different states. So that really helped me understand, build a team for construction. And that has helped me to open quicker, faster, and cheaper.
As we get towards the end of the conversation, like zoom out a little bit, as you think about the evolution of the sport and like what mainstream adoption looks like in the US relative to, like you said, started in Mexico, there's other countries like Spain, for example, that has an abundance of courts, or certainly more than the US has. What has to happen for to become like mainstream in the US? Is that time? Is it, someone like you opening more locations and people getting familiar with it? Like, what does that look like?
I mean, as I mentioned, there's very few courts compared to the number of people that are in the US. The US is a very big country, obviously. The sport is still growing 100% year on year in terms of number of players, number of clubs. So I think we're going to keep seeing this growth of 100% for the next 3 years at least, until we get to a point where every major city and every tier two city has one or two clubs. But obviously, given how construction, and this doesn't only apply to paddle clubs, this applies to brick and mortar in general in the US, it just grows slower because there's more regulation, it's more expensive in real estate than in countries like, as I mentioned, Sweden or Middle East, where you don't have to go through all these hurdles to open a location.
Like, what type of impact does it have? There's been a push, again, in my mind, just likening it to pickleball, and that might not be a great comparison, but maybe it's like the only one we have, or at least the most recent, where it's like, hey, we want to have more media exposure. We want to have leagues and competitions. We want to have pro athletes. We want to, like, all of these things. Does that have to happen, or is that beneficial for your business if that happens? Or is it more so like, in this instance, at least now, it seems like you're driving and able to dictate some of that like evolution and adoption, where it like might be more beneficial for you than it just a huge boom that explodes that then everybody rushes to the scene? Like, so what role does like all the ancillary kind of aspects of the sport play?
Well, now that you mentioned pickleball, I think pickleball and all racket sports are complementary to each other. They don't compete directly. Like the person that plays tennis also plays ping pong, also plays squash. It's not like you choose one and you don't want to touch the other sports at all. So I think pickleball coexisting with paddle, definitely. Pickleball coexisting with tennis, definitely. Pickleball coexisting with tennis itself. And then in each one of these, I think there's different concepts. Some will survive, some will not. Even in paddle, I'm telling you, there's 100% growth expected for this year. But at the same time, it will be the first year in 2025 where you will see paddle clubs closing because of bad management, bad locations, more competition that didn't exist in the past.
And then if you're looking ahead, still super early for Paddle House, like we talked about growth and you focusing on those things and the locations that are already in the pipeline. Do you have, call it, the 5 and 10 year vision for what this looks like in the US and potentially internationally, if that's of interest or on the roadmap?
Well, yes, we want to get to 40 locations in the next 3 to 5 years nationwide. And that should put us at about 150 courts. Give or take, some locations have three, some locations have eight courts. I think that we're in the right track. I think we're in the driver's seat now, and we want to keep it that way. So the plan is use organic cash flow, raise more money from potential investors. We're looking for the right ones, and keep on growing to new cities.
And for anyone who, whether it's in the cities that you mentioned, New York, Nashville, Atlanta, Denver, and then potentially checking you out there or bringing concepts as you start to grow to new cities, getting involved there, what's the best place for them to learn more and follow along?
Yeah, well, we are, as you said, New York, Nashville, Atlanta, Denver. We're soon to announce two more cities that we're going to be building in 2025. And we always look for cities that are growing, that have wellness first community, and that also there's people that have some racket sports ingrained in their forehead.
Awesome. And then where would you point them, the website or social, or if they wanted to get in touch, what's the best way to kind of keep up with all things Paddle House?
Instagram at Padel Haus. That's PADELHAUS. Our website, www.padel.haus. And we have a newsletter where we typically announce everything related to activities of the club, the company, grow new locations.
Perfect. We'll make sure that all that information is linked in the show notes. I encourage people to reach out, follow along, and check you out if they're in the city that you have a location. And thanks so much for joining us.
Awesome, Joe. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you got value from the conversation, please consider subscribing and sharing the podcast with a friend or colleague. It's a massive help. And if you want more content like this, including news and insights on the latest industry developments, subscribe to the Fitt Insider newsletter at insider.fit.co. And one more thing, you can learn more about our recruiting and consulting services at fit.co. That's FITT.co. I'll see you here next week.